everyone. Welcome to the Film Element Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Ant, and welcome back for another episode. Today, I will be reviewing the new release from A24 called The Undertone. Now, this is coming out this Friday, March 13th, worldwide, or not worldwide, at least in North America. And I was actually fortunate enough to get a special screening last night in Toronto with the cast and crew. And so I had just seen it last night. I'm recording this the next day on Tuesday. I don't know what, I think it's the 10th today. Yes. It's the Mario Day. You know, when you put MAR and 10 and it looks like Mario, it's the official Mario Day. I might actually be wrong. But anyway, so I'm recording this having seen it just last night. And I'm here to give my fresh perspective on it. Now, one thing I want to talk about, and this is, a current theme in as many podcasts as I try and do, is that, I want to talk about my connections to these films. Like, I probably will talk about just random mainstream stuff that comes out, but I also want to really talk about independent stuff that I have a connection to. Now, this film was produced in Toronto. It was filmed in Toronto, and so my connection to it is, it's not a deep one, but basically everyone that made this film, most of the people that made this film, are somebody I've worked with or associated with. Now, specifically, there are two producers. This was produced by one of the production houses, was called Black Fawn Films. And so for me personally, that Black Fawn was founded by two guys named Cody Callahan and Chad Archibald, who are directors in their own right. So they directed a lot of films with Black Fawn over the last 10, 15 years. And I was fortunate enough to edit the last 4 horror films that came out of Black Fawn. So the first one I did was called I'll Take Your Dead, and that was directed by Chad Archibald. Then the next 2 were directed by Cody, and that was The Oak Room and Vicious Fun. And those were done, I think, in the same year, pretty much back to back. So that was a really great experience. And then COVID hit, and then Chad was able to finally direct his next film called It Feeds. And I think that was filmed in 2023, and then it finally got a release last year in theaters, and it got a worldwide showing. And according to everyone involved, it did very well in theaters. Made its budget back. Everyone that was associated with it was actually very happy with how that turned out. So that was probably the biggest film I've ever been associated with. That starred Ashley Greene and Shawn Ashmore, respectively. And so they're on this great upward trajectory, Black Fawn, with a lot of successful films. In my opinion, the last 4, I know I'm probably biased in saying this, but the last 4 that they did were definitely the best films that they had done, and they seem to just get progressively better. I like all of them, all 4 of those films that I worked on equally in a lot of ways. The last one, It Feeds, was certainly a step up in production value and just scope and ambition, and I think that paid off in a lot of great ways. So I think if you're in Canada, I think it's on Crave. That's called It Feeds. And so this, not only do they direct their own stuff, but they're also a distribution arm. So they, then they specify in horror. So a lot of independent filmmakers release their films through Black Fawn or even get financing. So, and that seemed to be the case with this one, Undertone, that was filmed I don't know how long ago, maybe a year or 2 ago. And it was written and directed by Ian Tucson. And so I'm very close with Chad and Cody because of those 4 films. And Cody was one of the main producers on Undertone. And so that's one connection I had. But then on top of it, you guys have heard me talk about a film that I made back in May called Back Pay. And I'm going to talk about this in every podcast and every situation I can, because I got to get the word out so that when it comes out, you guys are like, oh, there's Back Pay. He's been talking about this forever, talking our ear off. So one of my castmates in that film, her name is Celeste Calderon. You've probably heard me mention her before. She so the timeline is funny because I had. Let's rewind a little bit. So the story of how this tiny little indie feature, Undertone, got on the radar of A24 is that it premiered at Fantasia over the summer. And as Chad has told me, and Cody as well, that there was basically a bidding war for it through many different studios. I don't know who all was involved. I know Eli Roth was one of the people. Eli Roth, Chad, Cody, and even myself all have a bit of a connection. We've all directed for him before. I worked on a show of his called Urban Legend, and I was fortunate enough to direct the season finale. And Chad, and he's a big fan of Chad and Cody's because of obviously they're pretty well known in Canada and I think internationally. Black Fawn, has a strong brand, especially in the horror space. Some would argue they're the Canadian Blumhouse, which, is obviously a great mention in my opinion. But it feels like their material has never really broken through the way a lot of us think it should. And now, obviously, Undertone seems to be where that's happening. So Undertone, and this is a variety article that has talked about this, but Undertone was bid on by, I think, 5 or 6 studios and then eventually was won by A24, who made, according to the article, a 7-figure offer. And that sent shockwaves through the Canadian film industry because an acquisition of that size and that high profile is just not something that we've seen, certainly not seen enough of. And you've probably heard me talk about it in previous podcasts. But this was a big moment. This was a really great sort of validation for a lot of Canadian filmmakers by, a U.S. studio recognizing that not only are we making stuff up here on our own, but we are making stuff that is marketable and valuable and has real revenue potential. And that's not something we talk about very often. We always just sort of accept this second-class citizenry in the film industry that, listen, we can make whatever we want, spend however much we want, but at the end of the day, we're not going to compete with the U.S. I think this sent a really big message that, no, even a really tiny Canadian film can compete on that level. Now, where we end up with all of this, who knows? Did they overpay? You would like to think not. I'm sure that they didn't and I'm sure we're going to see this when it releases this weekend, that, the money was worth it. So that's a really incredible thing. And obviously Cody is associated specifically with that as one of the producers. So to watch him, I watched him on one side of this, break his back with his films and producing and just, we're all just trying to get these films recognized. And then to have something like this happen over the summer is just, you couldn't be happier for someone like that. And, everyone involved is so deserving. And so going back to my connection, so I had sent Saled the article of that. And I was like, hey, check this out. Like, I'm not saying this could happen to our film, and I sent it to everybody, but, I know the guys that this happened to, and this is crazy. So anyway, apparently on her own, she met the director at TIFF, and then he was interested in putting her in the film, and I sent him a clip from my film. He reached out to me, or someone connected us, and I sent him a clip of her in my film, and she ended up getting the role. Was it because of that or something else? I don't know. Not really important, but either way, she's deserving. And then she brought him to my 40th birthday, and I finally met this famous director that defied the odds of this tiny film becoming an A24 mega acquisition. And obviously I like Ian a lot, and I was blown away just by how soft-spoken and easygoing he was, especially now that I've seen the film and I see how intense it is, to know that this was made by a very unassuming, nice guy. That stuff is actually not unheard of in the film industry, but it's hilarious to see that. So I got to know him and at my birthday party, and he had a long chat. And at the time, and I can talk about this now because it's it's common knowledge. But at the time, he told me that he pitched and eventually got the new Paranormal Activity film, which is a great achievement, just based off of the unreleased Undertone. And so, then the film went on to go to Sundance, did really well there, and the hype machine just kept moving. So last night I was very, very excited to see the Undertone. Obviously, now one of my castmates is in the film, and I know a lot. Like I said, I know a lot of other people that are associated with it, Chad and Cody specifically, and it's just great to see them sort of get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. So that's sort of my connection. So I went in, obviously, someone in that position. You're now asking, well, you're going to be honest about your review now that you have all these people that are connected to it. And you know what? The answer is yes. I'm not going to pull any punches and pretend it was something that it was not. But fortunately, despite all that, I'm very happy to say that does it live up to the hype? I would say about 85 to 90% it does. The Undertone is probably one of the most uncomfortable 90 minutes I've ever had in a movie theater. And this movie theater was packed, and it was a big movie theater. So they had the premiere at the Scotiabank Theater, and if you're from Toronto, that's the downtown one, Richmond and John. And it's semi-iconic now in Toronto, I guess. I mean, I've been going to that movie theater for 20 years, especially when I used to live downtown in Toronto. I don't anymore, but when I did, that was every date night, every movie night. That's where I was. So this movie theater was packed, and as soon as it started, a lot of excited people in the audience, and you could hear a pin drop. And they said that comment before. Carolyn Morissette, she's the programmer of Fantasia. She introduced the film at the beginning, and she made that comment that at Fantasia, barely anyone was breathing from beginning to end. And last night was basically no different. This movie is tense, and it's tense in a very unnerving and uncomfortable way. First off, I'll try not to spoil anything from the beginning, and then when I do start spoiling, I'll let you know, because this is even before the film has come out, so I don't want to ruin the experience for anybody. But this film is very uncomfortable. To start off, they film it inside supposedly Ian's house, Ian Tucson, the director. And it's based off of an experience he had with some ailing parents who were, near the end of their life. And so they film it in the house that I guess a lot of this happened. And the house is, like I was telling Cody last night, there is not even an exterior shot, I don't believe. Maybe there is, and I didn't, but he confirmed it with me. He said, yeah, there's no exteriors. It's all the house. It's basically just two rooms for the majority of the film, almost all at night. And on top of it, the house isn't even an overly impressive house. Like, it doesn't have gothic tinges to it. It's almost more relatable because it's a house you recognize, or you feel like you might have grown up in, or your friend's house that you might have had a sleepover at. And upstairs, there's a very great stairway, like not a spiral stairway, but like one of those curvy stairways that like go slightly to the right. So that was a nice little theatrical piece, a cinematic piece, especially for a certain point in the film, a very certain point, scary point in the film that I'll get into later. But then you get upstairs, and it's like there's nothing even interesting on the walls. There's a few like Catholic paintings, but it was almost drab in a way, in a very indie way. and you go, I think this all helps. It's just crazy to think about. So the film starts. Basically, the film. I will give a summary at the very beginning. Uh, a podcaster. I don't know if she's a true crime or probably supernatural podcaster. Receives 10 audio files from a mysterious source, and her and her co-host, who you never see, just hear, go through each audio file, and it's about a couple, I believe, that is experiencing some form of strange possession, specifically the wife, who I believe is pregnant, or she finds out that she's pregnant. And they just get, with every clip, things just get progressively more and more creepy and unnerving. And then while our main character is listening to this, she's also caring for her ailing mom. And we hear a nurse at a certain point basically tell her she doesn't have long. It could be hours or a couple of days, but she's basically nearing the end of her life. So this poor young woman, played by Nina Carezzi, Kiri. I apologize, Nina, if I'm getting that wrong. I should have locked that down before I started this. But anyway, incredible actress, basically carries the film on her shoulders because it's basically all her. She's caretaking for her ailing mom, and then in between doing that, she spends her downtime listening and producing this supernatural podcast and listening to those audio files that are coming in. And then as she's listening, her and her co-host are sort of bantering back and forth and deciding, what is this? Is it real? What does it mean? And then dissecting what they're listening to, because as they go deeper, they're hearing weird musical cues from like the 50s, specifically a Baba Black Sheep. And they dissect London Bridge is falling down and Rockabye Baby, which is really troubling because I have a baby myself and I sing some of these songs, definitely Rockabye Baby. And now knowing, if I'm to believe the context that this movie is telling me, why these lullabies exist and what they're really about, I think I'm going to have to refrain from doing that, from singing those from now on. I think I have to exorcise those out of this household. And then, so things just sort of spiral out of control there. A lot of sounds start happening, and it starts to feel like our main character is being haunted by our own dying mother upstairs, who we don't see a lot of, and they're very smart to hide what's actually going on. And to be honest, that's basically it. There's no subplots, there's no left or right. It is a contained, really intense horror film done on an extremely small scale. But this is where I think horror always benefits, is that horror works the less you know about what you're going into. And I say that when horror is contained, it can create claustrophobia. So we don't get the relief of seeing her go outside. We don't get the relief of seeing her elsewhere in the world. We are stuck with her in this living room, dining room, while she produces this podcast and goes back and forth with her co-host. And that feeling of dread never lets up, and just gets worse and worse as the film goes on. I was talking about this with someone last night. Like, I feel like there's two tiers of horror films. And what I tend to enjoy, I'm not a huge horror film aficionado, but as someone who's edited at least half a dozen horror features, I have an appreciation, especially for the one side that is fun. There are horror movies that are fun. They're monster movies or they're slashers. Like, they're trying to let you have an entertaining time at the movies. And I think a lot of us appreciate those type of things, especially those are the ones that Scary Movie always makes fun of. So there's a lot of appreciation for that. But then there's the other side, And I would say this one certainly falls closer into that. And I would say Hereditary is a perfect example where you're not going to have a good time at the movies. You're not going to enjoy yourself. And you're probably only going to want to watch this once, maybe twice, and then that's it. Movies that just have very uncomfortable themes, create really like terrifying images, and just generally do whatever they can to make you wish that you weren't sitting there in your seat. Hereditary to me is a perfect example of just a film. I'm like, I don't need to see that again. And I respect what they did in the filmmaking, especially, but it was not an enjoyable watch, especially in the last 20 minutes of that film. I could definitely watch Undertone again, especially because I know so many people involved, and I probably will at some point with somebody. But I like that first viewing and the sound design. I know it's getting a lot of hype, and deservedly so. The sound design of us listening in on these audio clips, and then because we're listening to them through headphones that the main character is wearing. But there are other stuff happening, I think we are meant to believe, inside her house, sound-wise, that the main character may or may not be aware of. And then on top of that, we're also hearing what she's hearing from these audio clips, which just get, like I was saying earlier, progressively scarier and scarier. And it gets to the point you go, I don't know. I don't know why I'm here. This is terrifying. But like I said, as someone who's literally directed horror and edited horror, I know that there is such an audience for horror films, and they have to be the most rabid fan base out of any genre that exists. You're not going to get romantic comedy panels and Comic-Con style conferences, right? Horror lovers are a completely different breed, and they consume everything. They don't leave anything on the table. And the other great thing is that horror seems to be the one genre that is still relatively reliable, at least at the box office. There's so much talk nowadays about what can we actually show in movie theaters that will bring out an audience. And, romantic comedy has certainly taken a hit over the years. Now they don't want to do any original IP basically at all, especially in big tent blockbusters. And I can understand that because when they do that, the audiences don't show up, even if it's good. There's such a hype machine that you have to build up that you have to wonder if it's even worth it, or especially if it's worth the money. I think of a film like The Creator. That was one of my favorite original sci-fi films that I've seen in years. And people just didn't show up for it the way that they, you would have wanted. And I thought that film was fantastic. So horror benefits from the fact that, and horror certainly has its remakes and sequels, so it's not impervious to that as well. But it seems to be the one thing that original horror film and the ROIs that horror films make, like it's the stuff dreams are made of. When you think, like, I don't know what the box office has to be for A24, but if you just think about Undertone of like what they made it for, and then what it got bought for, and then even then those aren't big numbers, so they only have to clear 8 figures, at the box office, and then it's a hit. And there's so many stories of like just these small, $500,000, $1 million films, $2 million. And then it goes on to make $100 million. Like there's a Barbarian. There's a film I know people involved with In a Violent Nature. That was another really great indie horror film story where it was just going to be a streamer, and then last minute they decided to put it in theaters, and then it made a couple million that they weren't even expecting, right? That they hadn't even planned for, and then they get to just get this extra money. Because horror still is such a collective experience. It's such an enjoyable collective experience. You know, when I saw It Feeds with the crowd last year in Hamilton, I had seen it a million times because I had edited it. And it was like I was watching it for the first time when I saw it with that audience. Watching everyone jump and just clutching themselves because they're so tense and uncomfortable. Like, that's what you do it for. You do it to live in those moments. I tell people, I'm like, it's almost like a live concert. Like, especially if you have like a full movie theater and you just feel the weight and the vibes of everyone going back and forth and just trying to survive these things. That's the great thing about horror films. And last night, Undertone, it was no different. Like, feeling that collective energy of how tense we were all. Like, someone would get up to go to the bathroom and the room was so dark that we're like, who the fuck is this? Like, even if they're in the aisle, it was like, everyone sit down. No one's going anywhere. We don't need anyone getting up and moving around and kicking seats and, you know, knocking over the popcorn. Everyone shut up. Because every little noise, we were all on such edge that every little noise would freak us out. And that's great. That's exactly the type of thing you want. So I'll try and wrap it up as much as I can, but I think it's great. I'm going to go into spoilers really quick because I have to wrap this up pretty soon. But I will put this in the top tier, most terrifying. Was I scared during the movie, or was I tense? And I would say I was more tense. There's certainly images in the film that, like, you know, are going to stay with me. I don't know if anything hit me as, say, like the headless girl in Hereditary or the girl in the nightgown in The Ring. But there are definitely a few moments, you know, especially when I went home and went to bed after the premiere, I was looking at all the shadows in my room a lot more intensely than I used to. But overall, I'm sure that will dissipate over a night or two. But the overall tension that I felt during that whole experience, I don't think... Yeah, like, I put that up there with Hereditary, which I did not see in theaters, but I will give it credit even when I did see it. I never saw Blair Witch Project in the movie theaters, but I did see it later. It didn't grab me as much the first time, but I feel like watching it recently, it actually got me more, and I'm not sure why. But I think the most intense horror film experience I've ever had was The Ring. Because I saw that in a movie theater. And I couldn't sleep for days after that one. Just little girls in nightgowns scare the bejesus out of me. So yeah, I would put Undertone in that top pantheon of, you know, just intense, no one can breathe, no one can move films. And I think that's as high praise as you can get it. It's like, and I give so much credit to Ian and his editing, you know, just in the cinematography. Like, there are all these angles where you're like, is something in the corner? Like, you spend half the film with these off-kilter angles of the lead actress doing her dialogue, and it's not conventional coverage where, you know, you have looking space, you know, you have rule of thirds and looking space. They play with that a lot, and they hold on, like, darkness, and you're like, is something coming out of that? When is something coming out of that? Because this is all I care about, and it just creates this incredible tension. It's so well done. So I'll go into quick spoilers here. So if you don't want it to be spoiled, turn it off now, I guess. But my final verdict as a story, and I was thinking about this. Horror films are tough, especially because the more you reveal and the more you explain, the more that the air gets taken out of the tension, specifically in horror. I think of a movie like M. Night Shyamalan's Old, where I was so into it, and then in the end, not to spoil if you haven't seen Old, they explain why they're getting old. And it goes off on a very unscary tangent in the last act of the film, and I was like, I would have preferred not to know that. I think. And especially the explanation that they gave, I was like, that's not really, that doesn't make the movie better. It actually kind of makes it worse. And even Hereditary, I would say, once, like, Hereditary is interesting, and I felt this way about Weapons too. There's so much great tension, and then they explain, oh, by the way, this is what's going on. And in Hereditary and Weapons, not to spoil those two, but spoiler, uh, basically the answer is, oh, by the way, magic is real. And you go, but I thought this was trying to figure out if this was psychological or supernatural. And then go, oh, no, by the way, it is completely supernatural. In Weapons, a witch really does have voodoo powers and can turn people into zombies. And you're like, okay. I mean, that's not that scary. That's just kind of weird because that can't happen in real life. And then the same with Hereditary. It's like, they actually say, oh, by the way, that demon that we've been talking about, he actually does exist. He is real. And we have headless people praying to him. And you go, but headless people can't move in real life. So this is not scary to me anymore. Religious people that believe in that stuff might be more unnerved by that, and I give them credit. And this is why I give the Undertone credit too. And like I said, spoiler, they don't really explain what's going on. And we are given, and that works for the film and works against it in some ways, because in a lot of ways, like I said, that's great horror, in my opinion. If you want to stay scared by the end, don't explain what happens, or try and give us as little as you can. And the Undertone definitely does that, and just keeps the final like 3 minutes is just so utterly terrifying and so much fun to watch. I was such a fan, especially because I know how small the production was. So to watch them go balls to the wall and all out, kudos to them. And that's probably what helped them with the sale. It's such a scary moment, and it's going to be iconic, especially a few moments specifically with it. It almost reminded me of like the end of Blair Witch, like it was on that level. And so that was fantastic. But then I think, and like I said, this is a hard thing that every filmmaker has to deal with. Do you explain? You have to find the perfect balance between exposition, explanation, and letting the audience decide for themselves. If a movie over-explains itself, it becomes very boring, right? That's writing 101. Don't overdo it. But another bad trope of bad writing is, especially with independent films, is don't under-explain it. Because at a certain point, we're not even going to know what's going on, so there's nothing that we can clam onto, right? I think Tenet is a perfect example of, you have to watch Tenet a few times to actually figure out what was going on. And I know a lot of people said that about the first Mission Impossible as well. Like, you have, as filmmakers, that's the secret sauce. That's the midline, the blue line. You have to find that perfect balance of explaining enough, but not too much. Like, explaining enough that people know what's going on, but not too much that you can keep the tension, right? So you have to find that mid-ground. And, a lot of people do it better than others, but even top-tier directors sometimes struggle with that. I think Undertone, for me personally, I would have liked just a little bit more understanding of why this was happening. And there was a lot of debate when it ended, and I had a couple of conversations with other people. I was like, so what did that mean? And because basically, like I said, I'm in spoilers, so the last 3 minutes happen. It's super scary, all this great stuff. It all builds up to this moment, and then it just ends. And it cuts to credits. And I think that's a spectacular choice, just in terms of like I was saying earlier, I don't know what happened, and they don't explain it. And that's a lot of fun just to leave it there. But I would say I just wish I knew, and maybe if I watch it again, I'll get another explanation. I'll sort of be able to piece it more together. But I felt that I was missing just a little bit of like how we ended up here. But that's that's nitpicky. I don't think anyone's going to care. I mean, I've seen reviews kind of touch on this point as well, that it sort of doesn't add up right at the end. But again, I think you go on such a ride that that's okay sometimes. And what, like, teenagers and young people are going to go see this. They're going to go see it on dates, and people are going to be watching this through their fingers. Like, just like I was doing this at points. When I thought I saw a character in the darkness, I was just like, doing the squinting with the one eye. Is like, I just don't want to be freaked out by what's about to jump out of the shadows. And that's what you want. That's what you want a horror film experience to be. You want people so tense from beginning to end. So yeah, Ian made a very specific choice where he ended the film, and I think it works for the most part. I would have liked a little more explanation and just a little more, like, a lot of threads I felt sort of weren't knitted together. But again, maybe we're better off not having that and just living in that unknown. And that's the great thing about horror. Horror films can get away with that. So I give Ian Toussaint a lot of credit, and a lot of credit to the Black Fawn guys for putting this together. I think this was a great film. I hope it's the success that A24 is banking on. It seems to be getting the hype and recognition that it deserves. So yes, that's my review of The Undertone. Thanks for watching. If you're on YouTube, please like, subscribe, share, even if you feel like doing that. If you're listening on Spotify, like, subscribe. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're finding this podcast, I keep seeing it pop up in different spots. I would greatly appreciate it. So thanks for watching.